In this video, we are covering parts 3 and 4 of Go Down Moses, one of my favorite books by William Faulkner. Let's do a deeper dive into this video and talk about some of the meanings behind this because chapter 3 kind of ignored by a lot of critics. Alright, and welcome to the CodeX Cantina. I am Una, there is no crypto today, and we are going to do a deeper dive into chapters 3 and 4 of Go Down Moses. Now, chapter 3, many critics will be quick to point out how this has very little direct narrative tie-in to the rest of the book, and some would argue that you could cut this chapter out completely and the book would operate just fine. I'm going to take the stance where I'm going to look at this with critical eyes and try to pull out the deeper meaning, and I think I have thematically what William Faulkner was going for, regardless of perhaps the tactic that he used to get there. I think this section was very cathartic for William Faulkner. Mississippi had the highest rate of lynchings from 1882 through 1968, according to the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. In terms of female victims and the support for public vigilantism, Mississippi also topped the records for the United States of America. So how do you talk about this from a societal phenomena perspective? This is a great example where you take a single person or family and use it to represent societal themes. This section deals a lot more with the grief that the Black community was going through, at least from Faulkner's eyes. And then later after this, into parts 4 and beyond, we deal with the Reconstruction and white view of it as well. So what did William Faulkner view? He viewed the white community as not recognizing still the citizenship and humanitarianism that the African American community was now granted by the United States of America. The story starts out with Ryder, a large, strong, African-American man, I believe 24 years of age, grieving the loss of his wife, Manny. He's digging a grave for her, all by himself. This is literally a man burying his grief, the grief that he feels for his wife. But let's talk about that name, Manny. In the previous section, we talked about how Lucas Beauchamp's wife, Molly, was a little bit of a surrogate for Caroline Barr. And you'll notice Caroline Barr's nickname was Mammy. So here you have Manny, and in the previous section, Molly, representing a little bit about what her role was to the Faulkner family. I quote the opening dedication, "To Mammy, Caroline Barr, Mississippi 1840 to 1940, who was born in slavery and who gave to my family a fidelity without stint or calculation or recompense, and to my childhood an immeasurable devotion and love." So she died in 1940, 2 years before this book was officially released. You can actually find her grave at the Oxford Memorial Cemetery, and it's well known that she would frequently share her knowledge of the pre-Civil War and Reconstruction era of William Faulkner. This woman alone was a huge connecting point to William Faulkner. Through her, I believe he was trying to express some of the grief that she expressed and how she dealt with things. She never learned to read. She never learned to write. And I think you heard Crypto talk about earlier in our Before Go Down Moses video. If you haven't seen that, please make sure you start there for this video series. But you heard him talk about how after abolition, they now free African Americans, in terms of speech, in terms of their ability to integrate into society, it was a little rough going at first. And I think what William Faulkner is trying to elicit in this section is some of that for the community that was never able to learn to read or write. I think that's what Ryder is meant to represent. So Ryder sees these footprints. I quote, "The pale, powder-light, powder-dry dust of August, from which the long week's marks of hoof and wheel had been blotted by the strolling and unhurried Sunday shoes, was somewhere beneath him, vanished but not gone, fixed and held in the annealing dust, the narrow, splay-toed prints of his wife's bare feet." So you'll notice that he says vanished but not gone. You heard us talk about in the Before Go Down Moses video, the past isn't gone, it's always here. And here Ryder is kind of experiencing that where he still sees his wife wherever he goes. He's seeing her footprints, he's seeing what she used to look like and what she used to do in his life. And he even sees a ghost of her as he goes back to the cabin that he's renting from Roth Edmonds, which is the only connection to the rest of the lineage story, is that he's renting this cabin from Roth Edmonds. But he leaves, he walks, he eats some food, it's tasteless. He goes to talk to the fireman at Worth the sawmill. Again, the food's tasteless. He begins working like a madman. And this is Ryder's way of expressing the grief. Is this a commentary about his Mammy Caroline Barr never learned to read or write and couldn't articulate herself the way maybe some of the people who were raised in a traditional education could? I think so. But look at the words. He mounting the trucks in turn to stand balanced on the load he freed, knocking the chocks out and casting loose the shackled chains, and with his cant hook squaring the sticks of cypress and gum and oak one by one to the incline. So we've got to stand balanced on the load he freed. We've got casting loose the shackled chains. And another line, and once free of the bottom's unbreathing blackness. So again, free and blackness brought into the statement. And another line, enveloping the strong, steady panting of his lungs until they too ran suddenly free as his moving body ran. But we've got a lot of usage of shackles, of freedom. Through the word choice that Faulkner, the narrator, is using, he's expressing these ideas of freedom, of grief, the things that African Americans were having a hard time expressing at this time, according to Faulkner. He's bringing out in this story, as he's talking about an African American that is suffering through grief of the loss of his wife and can't find the right words to express these emotions. There's just a lot of talk about oppression and inability to communicate at this point in time. So as I said, he's sitting there drinking with his dog at the moonshiner's place. His aunt comes up and says, hey, you need to come home right now. And eventually he goes home and begins to talk to her about God. But Ryder refuses to listen. And when she grabs him, they say that his arm is like iron. And we've seen this before in the short stories Two Soldiers and Barn Burning. Faulkner likes to describe someone who is unfeeling as iron or metallic-like. Those are the words that he's choosing to express Ryder's current state. He's emotionally distant at this point in time. So he heads back to the mill, and that's where he runs into Birdsong, who he knows is running a crooked gambling game. When he pulls out kind of the hidden die, that's when, Birdsong pulls out his gun, Ryder pulls out his razor and murders Birdsong at that point to save his life, in a sense, in this altercation, right? It's not uncommon to have people who are going through extreme traumatic events or through grief to get into these physical altercations to express themselves. Also, at this point in time, there's several references to the snake bite on his arm. This is more of the kind of like the biblical fall of man commentary. What caused the fall of man? The snake leading them into temptation, if you will. I think you also kind of see this commentary in Red Leaves, so I'll leave you to go to that video to check out more on that, but we're not going to go into too much detail on the fall of man, if you will, here. So we head into section 2, which is kind of a mirror of the first section, except this is told from the white community perspective. It's much colder. You get a much different interpretation where they're viewing him as he's working. He's not trying to work through things. He is just going about his day, working at the sawmill, doing a good job of working or burying her and then moving on instead of expressing perhaps things the way that they would. If you're not doing the things that we are, then you're doing something wrong and different, which was a very big racial issue at this point in time. The white community is viewing it as this guy, Ryder, is not behaving the way that they would. Since he's behaving differently, he must be doing something wrong because he's not like that. This is them being very racist. So we have this line, the coroner had pronounced his verdict of death at the hands of a person or persons unknown and surrendered the body to its next of kin, all within 5 minutes. So what this is conveying is that they didn't spend much time investigating who the murderer was. Since it was a victim, was a African-American individual, they're not going to go through a lot of investigation because they know what happened to him. The lynch law, as we talked about in the beginning of this section, was very popular in Mississippi. Not that it happened every day, not that it happened every single time someone broke the law, but this was a big fear and tool that the white community used to oppress the freed slaves. The cops are sitting there telling the story about how they arrested Ryder, how he kept trying to ask them to leave. The sheriff's deputy is representing the white view at this point in time, and you have the wife who represents the rest of the community, and she's not interested in hearing this story. This is boring. Stop talking to me about this. I don't care about what that person did. And then when he's hung at the end, it's the opening line and then it's the closing line, section 2, where Faulkner likes to play with time. This deputy sheriff and his wife, they're just not interested in talking about this. So what does this section really mean? Why does this get passed over so much critically when you can see there's a lot to this section? Well, yes, we have a lot of misexaggeration. The inability to communicate, the lack of the ability to read and write, and trying to express that through not only speech, but the inability for a writer to communicate things is overly exaggerated, and that is not the way that probably it would be written today. But what is the text communicating? And that is the lack of communication, which really did exist. I think Faulkner going through these discussions with his mammy is just really cathartically trying to express what a beautiful and wonderful individual this woman was in his life, and how the white community was using violence to ignore and silence them. It was denying them their life, liberties, their happiness that is due to them. And it's very, very sad the way that this story was brought about. So let's jump into chapter 4, and then we'll kind of do a complete wrap up of 3, 4, and where we are in the series so far. But chapter 4 is The Old People. This is a very popular one. It's a character study of Sam Fathers. Everybody seems to love Sam Fathers. Now, the opening line is, "At first, there was nothing." And critics are very quick to kind of point out some of the parallels with Genesis. Sam comes up behind him. There's this death of the deer. There's this quote, "Then the buck was there. He did not come into sight. He was just there." And if we go back to Genesis, we talk about how God just created the heavens. He just created animals on the earth on the second day, I think it was. So you get to see a little bit of the parallels here. And what Faulkner does is, as he structures the story, as you'll notice, he always puts Ike in the foreground, right? He's representing man. And then there's Sam Fathers behind him. So what is Sam Fathers representing? Since he's always standing behind Ike, you'll notice it's very specifically called out in like the 4 or 5 sections when like a big event's happening in this. Sam Fathers stands behind Ike every single time. So what's happening? Ike McCaslin has his first kill, and Sam Fathers initiates him. Sam doesn't have any children. He's the last of his lineage. That's the same story that's going to happen to Ike. And you'll see in this next section too, with the bear, there's a lot of talk about lineage. This whole book's about lineage, to be fair. So what's really happening? The hunting party soon arrive, and we learn about Sam's heritage at this point in time. How he's part slave, part Native American. He's the offspring of an Indian chief. But we get this interesting quote about heritage. "His cage ain't McCaslin's," he said. "He was a wild man. When he was born, all his blood on both sides, except the little white part, knew things that had been tamed out of our blood so long ago that we have not only forgotten them, we have to live together in herds to protect ourselves from our own sources." So this is a really good heritage discussion topic. So much of this book talks about the McCaslins, the cage that they've created, starting from the first chapter with Tenny and Turl, what they allowed them or not allowed them to do, around Lucas Beauchamp, the son of Tenny and Turl, and what was due to him from a patrimony perspective. Outside of that cage, though, outside of the McCaslins, didn't we see just now in the previous section a cage or an operational sphere that Ryder was placed in? And we have this quote that his cage ain't McCaslin's, because he's not McCaslin bloodline, Sam Fathers. He was purchased by them, but it ain't his blood. Don't forget that Sam has 1/8 black blood in him from his West Indian heritage. Now, Sam is without kid. Ike is without kid. What's another thing that's passed down besides your blood? What's another thing that's passed down besides your heritage and patrimony? Knowledge. We have this plot about Ikimatube and about how he killed the puppies and showed how he was immune to this white powder. What's this really conveying in terms of killing off some bloodlines at this point in time? He's purifying some bloodlines, selling off Sam to the McCaslins. The same way the McCaslins, Buck and Buddy, were kind of denying the desires at the time, because abolition was legal to that point in time, that Turl had to love Tenny, another slave at a different farm. It's important to keep track of all of these events of the blood, of where blood is, what patrimony is being passed down, and what knowledge is being handed to everyone, because that's the whole structure of these first 4 chapters, you'll notice. So we kind of jump back in time now. Ike is just starting to learn from Sam. Sam is the priest of the forest. He's the one that knows how to get around. He's the one that the people rely on to navigate the forest, to hunt in this forest. We get a line, "I'll never get a shot," the boy said. "I'll never kill one." "Yes, you will," Sam said. "You wait. You'll be a hunter. You'll be a man." Faulkner playing up masculinity and knowledge at this point in time. So let's head to section 2. Section 2, we kind of time jump back to what most people would call kind of like the baptism of Ike, where Sam is spreading the blood on the boy's cheeks, birthing him to the next part of his life and passing on his knowledge. That's Sam's version of patrimony, the knowledge that he can give, because he's not strong in material items, he's strong in knowledge. So what happens now? We got our boy Boone comes in and says, "I just saw this huge 14-point buck." They get their guns, they go hunting after it, and the man that never misses, Walter Ewell, fires his shot. And he doesn't miss. He's the sniper. So Ike and Sam think that he's killed this huge buck. And that's when Sam, standing behind Ike at this point in time, tells him to look up, I think on the top of the ridge, I think it was. And we have the quote, "And it seemed to the boy, too, that it would take them forever to decide what to do. The old man in whom the blood ran cold and slow." So we're talking about a generation winding down at this point in time. What do you do when you start winding down? You make sure you train the next generation. So up at the top of the ridge, suddenly we see the huge buck. And Sam says, "Ole, chief, grandfather." So I think this line confuses a lot of people because at this point in time, we're lacking context of what does this mean. You'll notice in the next section, and we're going to go into it right now, is when he starts to talk to McCaslin. Everybody heads back to Despain's place, and that night Ike spends the night with McCaslin Edmonds. And Ike's telling him about this big buck. We saw this big buck. You know, Walter shot that little buck up there, but you didn't see the big buck. You don't believe me, do you, Kaz? And Kaz is like, no, I believe you. I believe you, Ike. He says, suppose they don't have a substance, can't cast a shadow. Because he talks about how he saw it at one point in time. But if he saw it, why isn't Kaz the next generation? Why isn't he the one that got baptized and passed down the knowledge from Sam? Because there was no substance. Didn't even have a shadow. But what did Ike see? When he saw the big spirit grandfather deer cross past them, they saw large footprints imprinted into the ground. So at this point in the story, we're also talking about how he thinks Mother Nature doesn't like to keep things in the ground. It likes to give them back. So let's go back to that quote when he says, Ole, grandfather. This could be a way of Faulkner realizing that in Native American culture, they viewed kind of like more of a circle to life, if you will, that the ground was giving the spirits back, giving back what was his grandfather's bones and death to the world potentially. And Ike saw imprints on the ground at that point in time that Kaz and others that he tried to chain couldn't, which means Ike's kind of like the chosen one. He's the one that is one with nature and can see the changes and impacts that nature has. And that's why Sam continues to train him up through the next couple of chapters in this book. It's all meant to show who is going to succeed Sam, because remember, he doesn't have kids. So who's he going to pass the knowledge on to? And we're seeing that that's going to be Ike in this section. But what does this mean? What's the, okay, great. So Ike's going to be the next one. What's the point of this? So we've kind of touched on it a little bit, but every story up to this point talked about how things were denied to the slaves after abolition, after they became free American citizens. And we saw that it was their pursuit of ancestry, their ability to love and be with someone and pass the line on to others. In The Fire and the Hearth, we saw Lucas being denied some of the patrimony and lots of moments of where he was denied resources that someone in the white community were looking for would have received. In the Pantaloon, chapter 3, we saw a lot of misapprehension and a lot of denial of liberty in pursuit of happiness. And in this one, like we've talked about, this is the non-material side of things. So beyond just the money being passed down or the rights that is due to someone, where do you send the knowledge? And here we see the knowledge being passed down. Since Sam doesn't have his own kid, he's using Ike as his future priest of the forest. Now in the next section with the bear, this is going to blossom even further. Like, this isn't the end point. This is kind of the starting point of Ike is seeing, what does it really mean to own land? What does it really mean to own property? And just because I'm given something from a patrimony perspective, does that mean it's right? Does that mean I now own it? And I think what we're going to see in the next section is Ike kind of start to struggle with that. So while these stories are all separate, I hope you can see how they are very connected and very relevant to each other for understanding the story and what is ultimately what I feel like one of the most ambitious projects I've ever seen. We do have the bear already live, so you guys don't have to wait. You can go watch the bear videos now if you want. Coming up next week, we are going to wrap this series up with the 6th and 7th sections. Please consider subscribing so that you can check those videos out, and we'll check you guys out later. Una out.